And then let me welcome you to this discussion starter session at the virtual EQAF in 2021. I'm Ronny Heintze. I'm here as a member of the EQAF program committee, and I will chair this session where we have two different inputs in the context of data and conversations. Is that opposites or does that complement each other? It's a discussion starter session, so it's not a session where we will elaborate for a long time about a paper and present, but more have some input from the researchers, from the experienced, from the people who give the input, and then enter a discussion with you all in the audience. Without further ado, let me move to the first input, coming actually from Gabriel Heinrichs, who's a researcher at the University of Groningen, and his study, Epistemic Trust and Accreditation Panels, is conducted in cooperation with the colleagues of NVAO, with assessment agencies, institutions, and other stakeholders in the Dutch accreditation processes. I'll leave the floor to you, Gabriel, right away. After 5 minutes, I'll be back and we'll open the direct interaction with all the others.
Yes, Ronny, thank you for your introduction, and thanks to EQAF for having me. It's my pleasure to present to you, everybody here online. Hello. My introduction called Do Accreditation Review Panels Require Spoken Testimony to Trust Written Evidence, which is based on my research into accreditation review practices in the Netherlands, and which I hope will elicit a lively Q&A. First, let me shortly set the stage for my proposition. For external quality assurance of higher education, the ESG specifies that external assessment panels or review panels or expert groups, that they should include two classes of evidence. First, the panels study self-assessment, usually written reports, and then they observe things firsthand during site visits, speaking with students and staff and others. Now, these two classes of evidence are needed for the panels to get a complete picture, a complete idea. That is, sufficient information, but also, I would like to argue, to build sufficient epistemic trust, especially between the program and the panel. With epistemic trust, I refer to the notion of trust relating to knowledge and its sources. In short, do I trust the veracity and the relevance of certain information, for instance, because I think its source is reliable? Only with sufficient epistemic trust can we accept information as evidence. Now, to start with these self-evaluations, my research suggests that in themselves, they are often not adequate for the panels to acquire sufficient information, despite the fact that they are usually quite extensive. The panel members will, for instance, remark that they are that the self-evaluations are incomplete, or the standards are mixed up, or that they read more like self-promotion instead of self-assessment. Now, some of these issues won't be solved by adding more information. Instead, to address them properly, I would argue that it's the conversations during site visits that are crucial for the panels to accept information as evidence. I will now shortly explain why and how. First of all, though, fortunately, the conversations during accreditation reviews have a few features that are very helpful regarding epistemic trust. For one, the panel members are selected for their expertise and reputation in the first place, and a trusting commitment is required of the panels by the QA agencies. And the panels and programs are usually each other's peers. So there is already a feeling of mutual intellectual respect. Now, with these criteria being fulfilled, epistemic trust is then confirmed by engaging in conversations, exchanging arguments during the site visits. And in that way, the panels in the program confirm their mutual trust. It's useful to realize that in broad strokes, there are two things that affect trust in conversations. I trust the person speaking, and I trust what they say. For instance, regarding a person, I can infer their intentions, that they arrive on time, for instance, and I'm able to assess their interest in saying either this or that. And regarding their arguments, I can assess, is their argument acceptable vis-a-vis my existing beliefs, or is their argument coherent with the other interlocutors that I've spoken to. Now, for my research, I'm observing and interviewing reviewers, and these are some of the things they've said about such trusts. For instance, when a program staff is disclosing sensitive details during the site visit, which is not in the self-evaluation, like a new dean was appointed and they are making it work. So this is about intention. Or they'll say, first we are students, then staff and management. And it's the information coming from all these different sources that give you, as a reviewer, the confidence that you have a clear picture. This has to do with coherence. Now, there are many more examples, but my 5 minutes are almost up. So I'll skip this one, because these were some of the examples of decreasing and increasing trust that I found. But now I would really like to hear about your experiences around this subject. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Gabriel, for kicking this discussion off with your input. So this is the encouragement to all the participants. You can either use the Q&A with the Q&A to the left side of your screen and insert your questions there, or you can even hit the broadcast live button and join the conversation. While you're probably answering your first questions and reaching out to Gabriel, there is, Gabriel, I think you explained that there is that the trust is a key issue that can happen in the conversation. In your research, did you find like any kind of behavior, any kind of statements that promote or that would particularly diminish the trust of the panels in whatever the institution was presenting?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think the first and foremost, one thing that many review panelists will mention is openness, sincerity, honesty, almost to the point that you would advise a program to reveal something during the site visit that's not already in the self-evaluation, like the example I mentioned, almost. But it's if the panel has the impression that people from the program or the institutions are sincere, and that's about what they say, but also how they say it and how they react to certain questions. That's one very important factor increasing epistemic trust in this regard.
Yeah, there is a question, and it speaks for the fact that we have many people from QA agencies around here as well, because I think this is a very relevant topic for both sides. So Laura Crane is asking, is there a difference between in-person and Zoom conversations that were explored? So what's the impact of going virtual, and is there a difference between the Zoom and the live meetings? But seeing that we have in the audience also many representatives of the QA agencies, and I see some colleagues on the list here, is that probably something that yeah, Gabriel is back. Gabriel is back.
My apologies, the system had a bit of a crash.
Good.
You were saying, Ronny, sorry.
So we were addressing the question that actually Laura Crane was raising. Is there a difference between in-person and in Zoom conversations that were explored?
Yes. Well, what reviewers usually will really miss during Zoom site visits are two things, especially. The first is the fluency of the exchange. So with a normal site visit, there will be a fluent and a natural exchange of ideas and arguments, which won't be hampered by lags in audio and video like we are probably experienced right now. So this is a good example. It's harder to exchange arguments and see what the other means when you have to do it through a screen. And the other one is when you're using Zoom, it's really easy to miss all sorts of very subtle cues which are not verbal, like people sitting like this or sitting like this, or staff members exchanging looks when you've asked them a probing question. So all these subtle cues which allow you to read the room, so to speak, which well you really miss, which reviewers really miss when they have to use Zoom.
Absolutely. So we have some guests. We can reach out to Sonia for her to be on screen live. So I think that should work technically. So we'll give the floor to Sonia.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. So
okay, great.
What is your question?
So actually I raised my hand when Gabriel asked at the end of his presentation for our experiences, and I would just like to share a very short story. So where I used to work previously at Saarland University, we had a system accreditation with peer reviewers, and then one of them didn't trust really the students that we selected. He said, okay, now you have selected maybe 5 really good students to talk to us, or maybe the ones that you know, and then he went on campus and just asked students himself and did a survey by himself. So he went to the bus stop and asked students there, he went to the library and interviewed some students there, and then when he came back he said, okay, now I do believe you. So everyone knew you and was impressed about the quality of us. And so I think this is also just a funny example how you can then have a second layer of control when you even don't trust the conversations. So I would just like to share that as an example.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sonia. Gabriel, you want to follow up anything on that?
Well, that's a really interesting example, Sonia. So thanks. One I heard similar stories about. I suppose most review panels will assume that the people they speak to have been selected by the program, expecting them not to go rogue or anything, to have some sort of a common narrative, at least, even if the narrative is a bit critical about the program, but not or institution, but not too critical. But most review panels will assume that that there has been a bit of a pre-selection of the panels.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Sonia, for bringing that to the table. And I think, Gabriel, what you were pointing out is going into the direction I think that Alexandra Puffin is also asking. And that is the question, how honest are the conversations during the site visit with members of the institution being prepped so extensively, and sometimes are even told what to say and what not to say? So how honest are these conversations with all that prepping?
That's a good question. I think most review panels will look into probing the coherence of the arguments and the answers given by all the interlocutors in between sessions. It's almost like interviewing for alibis. Like you can ask one question to students, and then in the next conversation you ask them to staff members, and you try to find out if there's a minimum level of coherence between the different groups, because I suppose it will take an enormous amount of coordination between the different groups to actually prepare all the answers and all the alibis, if you'd like to call them like if you would like to call them that.
Yeah. So Evelyn Keturakite is pointing in another direction, and this is probably also impacting and has a link to the trust that you were discussing. So and the question is how experts should assess the fact that the information in the self-evaluation report differs from the information received during the site visit. So what to do about that?
That's a really good question. So thanks. I think that once again, review panels are used to the idea that self-evaluations are a bit of a compromise, between the staff and the management and students as well. With often the management having the last say before the self-evaluation is sent to the review panel, and in the conversations they are speaking with students and staff directly, where self-evaluations are sometimes written by policy advisors or even external writers of these reports. So reading a report, reviewers know that what they are reading has been edited or is a compromise or is not completely coming directly from the mouths of students and staff. And it's students and staff that they trust especially. Sorry, managers, but it's the teaching staff and the students that most reviewers trust most.
It's good to hear that this is a shared perception, also supported by research. Silvia Santos raises a quite interesting aspect in this context. Did you explore the importance of different cultural backgrounds of the stakeholders to better understand whether or not there is sincerity? Because I mean, the question of sincerity, of trust, there might be a cultural dimension. Did you look in that as well?
I am looking into it, but I have not been able to reach conclusions about it. Ask me again in 1 or 2 years, because I think it might be important, but I'm not able to say anything about it right now.
Okay, so that's probably a very interesting thing to follow up and maybe look at it later. So Gea von Sutwen points, are there any characteristics or elements in the self-evaluation report that greatly influence the trust when panels start the site visit? So when you look at the self-evaluation report, is there anything that you could indicate where you say, okay, that's the good, that supports the trust as a beginning point?
It usually helps. One thing that I've heard more than once discussing self-evaluations is making sure that the right information is written down at the right standard. So in the Netherlands, usually re-accreditations are assessed by 4 standards, and writing the information for standard 1 at standard 1, that helps, because there are often quite some mistakes made there, and that makes it harder for the panels. And you must realize most panelists do this on a ad hoc way. They've been doing reviews once or twice or a few times, but this is not something they do every week. So if the information for standard 3 is at standard 1, they will get very, very confused. So that's one very important thing to look into, that the right information is in the right position in the report.
And I mean, that's a clear message also to institutions. And probably one of your prior comments triggered probably a follow-up question by Neil Gaskin, asking, so does the review team need a good cop and a bad cop then in order to find the right information? Is that a good approach maybe?
Only good cops, but asking the right questions. Just like I mentioned, review panels are instructed by and expected to be critical friends. So if it's like an inquisition, and reviews have been more like inquisitions a number of years ago, but they should be friendly conversations. The bad cop questions usually will make the program reluctant to answer sincerely, and that will probably also decrease the chance that they will use the assessment by the review panel to enhance their program after the accreditation is done, because we shouldn't forget it's not about checking whether there's a minimal level of quality, but also trying to improve the program, to enhance the program in the years after this round of accreditation. And I think the bad cop might not work.
Yeah. So Gabriel, I hope you're not disappointed that already we've reached the end of this conversation about how to create trustworthy conversations. I feel, and the list of questions that we see on screen here is still long actually, and expanding, and even some quite questions that are supported by many others. So don't forget Gabriel's name. You can reach out to him in the chat as well on the platform while later on during the day. So thank you for this great input. We'll now look at another way, and probably or potentially the opposite way to look at things. We move from conversations to data. And with that, I'm happy to see Ailsa on screen. Ailsa is the Director of Membership, Quality Enhancement and Standards at QAA. And in this, but also in her former role at QAA Scotland, Ailsa has led sector-wide activities focused on evidence universities use to support their decision-making. And I think you might bring some other aspects to the table, Ailsa. And since we're short on time, I'll leave the floor right to you.
Thanks very much, Ronny, and thanks to Gabriel for such an excellent opening session. Yes, in part of my previous life, I was also involved in looking after some reviews, so I'm really interested in that chat. A very good morning to all of you colleagues. It's lovely to see some very well-known people amongst the participants, and also some new people too. So thank you very much for joining, and thanks to EQAF for the invite, and thanks for working away in the background to make everything function. It's really wonderful to be joining you today, so thanks very much. I will skip on. We live in a world of big data, and the challenge is for us to help our staff and our students to navigate that data landscape and make the best of the data that we do have. There isn't a shortage of data, but there can sometimes be a shortage of knowing exactly how to use it in the best way possible. I want to draw on two projects that QA has been involved in this regard. One, the first I'm going to mention briefly, was a UK-wide project, and one of the outcomes of that was identifying 3 categories that institutions can fall into in terms of the extent to which they have a data culture. In other words, the extent to which they use data to help inform their decision making. And you can see the 3 categories that the researchers identified on the screen here, and I expect we all know places that fall into each of those 3. The second project that I wanted to talk about today is one of the enhancement themes that we ran in Scotland. This was called Evidence for Enhancement, and it operated between 2017 and 2020. This 3-year-long project asked a number of questions that are both quite straightforward in some senses, but are also pretty searching. The theme asked the sector in Scotland what information is useful to help us identify and understand what we do well and the things that could be improved, that we could do better. We also wanted to ask whether we use the information we have in the best way possible to help us with that first question. And we also asked, do we have the right information? The enhancement theme covered a very wide range of activity, and therefore, let me just see, I'm on a slightly different order of slides here, goodness me. The enhancement theme covered a very wide range of activities, and so I'm just going to pull out a few key things there rather than talk about the full range of it. We identified quite early on 2 groups who we particularly wanted to be able to work with. Those were programme leaders on the one hand and students on the other. So let me just move to that next slide, picking programme leaders. So why did we pick programme leaders? Well, we know that programme leaders are at a pivotal point for the student learning experience. They're involved in designing the programmes that students study. They're probably also teaching the students directly, but they're also responsible to the university for monitoring and reporting on the programme and enacting institutional policy. So it's a tough and a pivotal position for them to occupy, with lots of data that they are both interpreting on the one hand and they're reporting on the other. As well as some of the more theoretical outputs, we produced a range of quite practical materials that we use to help support students. I think amongst the slides, you can see our student voice cards that we've talked about before. We also produced a really practical planner, which we originally produced for our student representatives to help them in identifying the kinds of evidence that would help them with the campaigns they were running, the points in the year at which they would have access to particular types of data. Now, although we produced that originally for students, it was actually quite helpful for a number of staff, and quite a few staff made use of those as well. But we didn't only want to look at numerical data. We also wanted to look beyond the metrics and to think about the things that we most value in higher education. And to make sure that the evidence we were capturing would actually help us with these. So a group of colleagues worked with many stakeholders across the sector, and they identified these 5 priority assets, or intangible assets, we sometimes talk about them. So these are the 5 things that the Scottish sector at that time identified that they valued most about higher education, but for which there are no ready metrics. And so we wanted to think about, well, how can we help staff and students to articulate these assets, and how can we help them to evaluate them, or to know whether the work they're doing is having a real impact on those particular assets. So a group of colleagues produced a model to help us do exactly that. And this model here is one that we use right across the UK to this day. In fact, I'll be running an activity next week looking at how we can use this model to evaluate the extent to which student engagement is affected by the kinds of interventions that we put into place. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop. I'm happy for the slides to go back down again, but I'm really looking forward to some discussion. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ailsa, for providing that good starter for a discussion on the topic. And while probably it takes a second or two for the audience to follow up and type the questions or be brave enough to raise the hand. So you were explaining about the evidencing value framework. So what kind of data could be considered as part of that? Is that qualitative? Is that quantitative? Could you elaborate maybe two sentences on that?
Yeah, sure. The key thing, when the model was first established, it was really designed to capture qualitative data, and it was designed to try and move away from a metrics approach where very often the metric you're looking at is only a proxy for what you really want to affect, or the change that you really want to see. So we wanted to be able to move away from that notion of proxies and into a world where you are actually identifying the value or the asset that you were seeking to enhance. So I gave the example of student engagement. So you would be able to articulate what was particular about student engagement, or one of the other priority assets we talked about, that was identified by the sector, which was the transformational impact of higher education. So the model was designed to be able to help staff and students to articulate what that is, what are the aspects of the transformational impact, and what are the kinds of indicators of that taking place or being affected by actions of an institution. So initially it was very much about qualitative data, but as we've progressed with using the model, and we've tried it being used in a range of institutions and for a range of different practices, we've actually found that the model can capture both metric orientated, so it can capture quantitative data as well as qualitative data. And in fact, drawing those two types of data together produces a really rich picture, which can be used at a range of stages. You can use it for strategy setting, you can use it to identify, where do you want to get to, as well as identifying how you can prioritise the interventions to bring about the effect that you want, and of course to evaluate whether you have in fact affected that asset that you wanted to impact in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Ailsa. And while people are still probably prepping for the Q&A, and I see lots of people saying thank you and sending applause, so there is good reception, but I make use of the opportunity and can't resist, because I work for a QA agency as well, and you have pointed out that you talked about the two key groups. So the program leaders and the students, and Jenny gave a nice comment as well, Jenny Pobiega, that they have interviews where they have these two key groups in the same room. But when did you also consider like the information needs of the reviewers in quality assurance?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Although when we're running within the Scottish system, we have a quality enhancement framework, and the enhancement themes are one part of that framework, and our review work is another part of that. You could use this model, the evidencing value framework model, if you were exploring matters with reviewers, and certainly you could do that as part of it. And the evidencing value framework can also be used if you're evaluating your review method as well. It has quite a lot of applications, and if you were doing that, then certainly the evidence that is coming from the review teams, both within the course of individual reviews, so evidence about a particular institution that they're undertaking a review on, as well as the evidence that reviewers generate themselves through their own experience of having engaged in a review, you can also take that into account. And certainly my colleagues within the Scottish sector now are looking keenly at that experience from both the reviewers and the reviewed, as we have come to the end of a particular review cycle, and we're beginning to look at how the methodology might adjust for the next review cycle.
Yeah. So we have a comment, and maybe you have an opinion on that. So and I can't identify who gave that comment. It says anonymous, but sometimes a honest self-evaluation report is misused by the review panel by reducing the accreditation years instead of bringing enhancement to the study program and to the institution. What is your perception? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that in order to conduct a review, or reviews that are most likely to be constructive for the institution as well as the public interest, then it's really important that you have an honest self-evaluation. It needs to be constructive and not constructed, or not a promotional document or otherwise dishonest. And I think that those of us who are responsible for designing and managing review arrangements, I think it's a really good idea to place a lot of emphasis on helping to support and encourage institutions to really produce as honest an evaluation as possible. And in order to do that, I think you need to look at how we write about those evaluations, the place the evaluations take within the review method, and the extent to and the whole way that you engage with them. I think you have to prioritise honest evaluation over those more promotional or less honest statements, because it's going to be, and part of that, I think, is about convincing the institution that's being reviewed of the purpose of review and the benefits of review. Review isn't something that you go through in order to punish people. It's something that we should be going through in order to make sure that we're delivering the best educational experience we can for our students, and in order to make sure that the institution is best placed to meet the future and current challenges that it's facing. There are tricky things about higher education. We don't expect to walk into an institution and see that everything is perfect, but we would want to walk into an institution and expect that the staff who are working there are able to honestly evaluate what is happening, that they are aware of the things they do really well, and that they understand why they do them well. And we also want them to understand the things that they're maybe doing less well, or that they would like to develop in, and to be thinking about how they're going to approach those developments. How are they going to seek to enhance or improve what they're doing? And I think that if you can have that kind of honest evaluation, then you can have a tremendous amount of confidence in that institution. So I think that's where the encouragement needs to be. If a review begins to be a bit more of a tick box exercise, or begins to feel more like jumping through a set of hoops because one should, then then it's going to be very difficult for you to really get the value out of having gone through that exercise.
Yeah. So before, because I think we're trying to, this is like talking two different ends of the same story sometimes. Before I will invite Gabriel back, because I'm quite sure that there's also a nice perspective on that. Let's have one more question. So, do you already have information on how student representatives appreciate the model and instruments? You already have info on that? Yeah, but yeah, let's Ailsa, do you have already information how student representatives appreciate the model and instruments that you were just presenting?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we designed the model with students. We didn't design it for them or ask them later, but we were actually intrinsically involved. They were involved in identifying the assets about higher education that we value most, and they were involved in identifying the kinds of evidence that we might look for in order to determine whether or not the actions we were taking were actually able to influence those intangible assets. So yeah, what we want to keep doing is to keep that evaluation going, because we're not, it's a model that we're continuing to use, so it's important that we should keep asking the students. But they at the time we were designing it and when we were first implementing it, they did like it, because they could because they had had a part in designing it. I think that was the other thing. They felt strong ownership of it, but they also liked the fact that we were not dealing in proxies. So we weren't dealing in indicators that were about things that were slightly to one side of those assets that we value most. So we weren't talking about looking thinly at student satisfaction, for example, or usage of libraries, or looking at the percentage of students who get graduate jobs at the end of an experience. We were actually fundamentally looking at the nature of the experience itself, and I think they appreciated that. So, but we need to make sure that continues to be the case as we continue to roll it out. So we need to keep honing it.
Absolutely, Gabriel. Having you back, and we've even with Ailsa's presentation and when answering the question, the word trust and the relationship between what reviewers do with these data and how that impacts site visit, it came up a little bit. Any comments on you? What do you think about what we've just heard and discussed?
Yes, well, extremely interesting, Ailsa. So thanks for your presentation. One thing I was wondering, in your initiative, you'd like to support students and educators and also reviewers in using all sorts of information coming from many sources, I suppose. Do you have an idea? And which sort of sources are appreciated most or are found to be most relevant to these different stakeholders? So do students have different likes, for instance?
I'm sure you can do that in 3 sentences.
That's a really interesting question. I think the evidence they like best, I think, depends very much on the question that we're trying to answer. It depends a little bit on who the individuals are as well. I mean, I mentioned earlier that students liked the evidencing value framework because we were looking directly at the asset. We were the aspect of HE that we were trying to affect. But actually, there will be some students who just want to know if they're going to get a job at the end of a program, and who, despite our best efforts, do have that instrumental view of things. And so it does, it does vary quite a bit. But what we wanted to be able to do was help people to understand what is the evidence you're looking at, and what are the reasonable conclusions you can draw from that evidence.
Ailsa, thank you very much for this input, starting the discussion and showing a different perspective. I think the session showed that what might seem like to be opposite ends of the same story, it really is the same story, and both aspects need to be linked. And I think we only managed to have a starting point of that discussion. And I think it's really valuable to continue to follow what you're both doing, what are your findings, and we can look at it maybe later on again. So we've already reached the end of this discussion session. Thank you to Ailsa and Gabriel, to both of you. Thank you also for the audience for participating, for even being brave enough to go live on screen. And make that even more interactive. I think that is a quality that we're all looking for so much in this virtual surroundings.